We have about 50 minutes tops, I would say, to spend some time just reminiscing about the church from its earliest days to present. And we're going to facilitate that through the folks that you see up here. And we hope that it'll be a time that allows you to remember some things as well, and you can share those with each other throughout the day. First, we're going to introduce ourselves. I'm Lyndon Vicks, and I and my wife Annette began attending this church in 1985 when we moved here to Wichita, and have attended since. So I'm going to have each of the people on the panel give that same kind of information. I'm going to start down with Jana. Oh, yeah, we only have one mic. Pass it on.
Hi, I'm Jana. I first attended in 1984 as a college student while I was here in Wichita, and yeah.
Shelley and I guess my voice does carry. Shelley and I began attending right after we got married, and I think that was right in 1986, so about 32 years.
I'm Bill Bennett, and my wife Patty and I began attending here the year we got married in this church in 1966.
Okay, I'm Patty Bennett, and I started in 66 when I got married. But I actually started here when I was 5 in 1951.
I'm Kendra Mullins, and I started coming here when I was born in 1994.
I'm Christy Gensel, and I started also attending when I was born a long time ago. The math is easy this year in 1978. But I think something else I'm going to add that's kind of cool is my grandparents started attending in 1957, and my parents attended after that, and so it's a third generation.
I'm Gary Reiswig. I started attending when I was born. I was here week 1, so I've been here for 55 years, 1962, and I would add that my grandfather helped build the church when it was constructed, my great-grandfather.
Barry Roggist, Diana and I started attending in '72 when we came to Wichita after graduating from Tabor, and I can remember both of these two ending up coming to church when they were little. And I know how old Christy is, but I won't tell you.
All right, and as you can see, we've got a fairly diverse group in terms of the time that they've been in the church and connected with the church, which should allow us to pick up another number of different areas of memories. Let me just ask of the people who are here, I'm going to assume that unless you're a guest here, you attend church now in the sanctuary where we meet. How many of you attended here when our worship services were held in this space before the sanctuary was born? Raise your hand if you attended at that time. Okay? How many attended when we had church at Gow? Okay, that's quite a good number. How about who attended at Millwood? All right. All right. Then I think a good place to start is with Millwood and Patty. As you said, you started there when you were 5. And so what are your early memories of church there and what it was like?
Millwood was a very small church. I think there were like 100 people maybe. I don't remember because I was too little and could care less at that age. But the thing I remember the most about Millwood is that we knew everybody. Everybody came from rural Mennonite communities, Tabor. My parents went to Tabor, and so most of the people at Second and Millwood, they knew. They knew them from going to school with them at Tabor, or they knew them because they were related to them. I think I was related to everybody a little bit. But it was a really small family-type church. And the big thing that I think made our church a little different was that there was so much music. Music, music, music. I mean, everybody, if you look out at the back of the church, there is a picture of a choir. It's a Christmas cantata thing. And there's like 30 people in the choir. Well, think about that. There were like 100 people in church. So, or less. And so everybody was in the choir. But I had great memories. I remember going forward and accepting Christ as my Savior. We were always baptized at Olivet because we didn't have a baptistry in that church. There's a lot of old fun memories from those times.
That was obviously quite a while before my time, but I do have a story from Millwood.
I'm not that old.
Sorry. Badly phrased. My uncle Art Vicks, who went to Tabor in the very early 40s, about the time the church was started, was working in Wichita and had told me the story about attending the church. I think mostly because there were lots of single girls there. That's what attracted him and one of his friends. And they spent a lot of time, it sounded like to me, at the pastor's house, which you'll learn if you read the little history in the booklet that is being distributed. The parsonage for Millwood at the beginning was in the basement of the church. And Estel Shale, the first pastor, and his wife lived in that basement. And my uncle told me about visiting there, and it would be hot in the summer, so they would open the windows that were at ground level. Well, 2nd Street was a pretty busy street at that time in Wichita, and there were no emissions controls to speak of. And he said they used to get sick in the basement from the exhaust fumes that would come in as traffic went by at 2nd and Millwood. So the pastor's residence was not exactly luxury quarters at that time. Patty, what do you remember, if anything, about moving from Millwood to Gow?
I think I was about 16, and Victor Becker was our pastor then. I think he was the one that got the whole ball rolling for building a new church. Is that right, Mary Lou? And I think we were all super excited because the church, we were outgrowing that little church by then, I'm pretty sure. When I was attending there, I was the only kid my age, but all my friends were a year younger. Nancy Booth, Nancy Croker, and there were several other girls, and there were a bunch of boys. And so we were looking forward to going into a bigger church with maybe more kids. I don't think we had any neighborhood kids coming to 2nd and Millwood. It was pretty much all Mennonite kid people. You know, our background was all the same. But I think going to Gow was a real exciting time. And for me, Gow was where most of my life happened. I should say, I got married there, my kids were born there. I don't mean there, but during that time. And we were all baptized, they were baptized there. You know, that was a big part of my life is Gow.
Let's talk a bit. We may not just do this linearly through time. I want to talk a little bit about what it was like being a kid in this church at various times. And Patty, you've already talked a little bit about what it was like at Millwood. Now, Gary, you were born into the Gow Church, as you said. What were things like as a kid at the Gow Church?
So I don't know that I have any great single stories, but I just have some memories. I remember in the summertime we had these stained glass windows, or they were colored windows, and if they were open, that meant it was going to be terribly hot. There was no air conditioning in the beginning, so I remember when I don't remember if I was 2 or 5 or 6. I'm thinking, why don't we have some fans or something in this church? So I remember that. Most of my memories are in the Dale Workington era. So Brent was one of my best friends. We would come to church and I would find him right away, and we would run all over the place. We played tag. There were certain shortcuts you could take. There were different stairs that went behind the baptismal, and if you were fast and speedy, which I thought I was extremely fast and speedy, I could go from the foyer downstairs, up the back stairs, and be in a great hiding place so Lori Workington could never find me. Which I thought I was just super fast. Maybe she was just 2 years younger and slower, and really she could never find anybody. But in my mind, yeah, I was like lightning fast. So I remember those days. I remember Donna Hershey leading us in these music howls. They would take place like in just a corner of the sanctuary, in the front of the sanctuary. And I have great memories of that. I actually called Brent today, asked him if he wanted to go over one of the songs with me, but he declined. So I still remember it if you want to hear it later. I remember potluck dinners in the basement. I remember when the basement wasn't finished yet, and we would still go to our Sunday school rooms, but there was the concrete walls, and so we go into these rooms and we have Sunday school. They're just little tiny things, and to this day I remember that the furnace room was the scariest place ever, and I would always avoid that part of the basement. But then we would have get-togethers where food would be laid out, and I don't know, it seemed like we had potlucks all the time, and you kind of knew which people made good potato salad and which didn't. And every once in a while, some rich person would bring Kentucky Fried Chicken, and that's like, oh, I'm gonna get one of those. So that was the primary. Those are some of the simple memories. The thing that, like Patty said, even at Millwood, it was a community of family, and I don't recall strife between people in our church. There may have been, but I was too young to recall that. But it never seemed like when we got together that we weren't of the same accord. And I do remember as much with the singing. And I remember that in Sunday school it was important to memorize Bible verses. It was very, very important that we understand that the Bible is God's Word, and having that focus or having that knowledge is going to serve you well someday. And so now as an adult, I still remember Bible verses that I learned when I was 5 and 6 and 8 and 10. And that's probably the most beneficial thing I recall from our church, other than the family aspect.
Right. Christy, you were a kid at Gow and then here at 21st as well. So what do you recall about that move and perceiving it as a kid and the stuff you did as a kid in both churches?
I don't remember a lot from Gow. Little things like Pioneer Girls and Space Cubbies, and just even the visual of where things were. I think in the basement, I was a little younger, and the rooms were split by a board that was chalkboard. Like that was the only partition, so it was obviously smaller. And then about elementary school, I think, is about when we transferred to this location. And I remember what is now in the offices. I remember on Wednesday nights, I think my mom was leading this singing, and we would be doing the Pioneer Girls thing and VBS, and Nancy Booth was our VBS teacher one year, and Barry brought us snake skin, just those kinds of things. And then in youth group, I started right about the time that Bill Hinneberg was doing junior high. I think was my tail end of junior high. And then Mark and Ruth Ann Willems were leading senior high. And so doing things, of course, like camp and youth conference was such a huge deal, getting to know kids beyond just our circle of youth group, because it was very small. I think my class had 3 people, and that was it. And there were, I think there were maybe 4 of us that were the same age. So that made it totally different. But things like mission trips. We traveled to Kentucky in the old brown church van, and it broke down when we got there. And we found out on that mission trip also that Neil was going to be our new youth pastor. And that was really exciting because it was our first time we were going to have a full-time youth pastor. And that was, for us, I think I was going to be a junior in high school. That was huge. We were, I think, one of the first maybe churches in the district that had that. His this is one of my favorite stories, he'll die when I tell this. I think it was maybe his first thing that we did as him as the leader. He pulls up on 21st Street and got a speeding ticket right in front of the church, in front of all of us waiting outside for him. That was pretty awesome. We spent 3 weeks, another mission trip, we spent 3 weeks on the beach in San Diego with our MB mission organization doing something called SOAR. And we had sand in so many places, even after we got back. But just building those relationships with my friends. Wednesday nights, we always met at Reg Nancy Booth. And again, we had a much smaller group, but it was those relationships that were so important that my friends here were my friends. I had friends at school, but my friends here were the people that I hung out with, that I felt like I was myself with, that even some are still now some of my best friends. So those were kind of the big things.
I'm going to ask Kendra to talk a little bit about growing up here in this church, but together with that, let me ask, how many people here attended Little Lambs preschool? Yeah. Many of you know that Little Lambs was a ministry started by this church that only recently was discontinued, and lots of children from the community as well as from our church attended Little Lambs. Kendra, you talk a little bit about what you remember about Little Lambs, first of all?
Yeah, man, Little Lambs was, I don't know, it's one of my favorite times. I went 2 years, and I had Miss Sandy, and she worked there for so many years. And I don't know, like I just remember going there every day, and my mom worked at the in the office Mondays and Tuesdays, and so she would just kind of pick me up and go home. But no, it was definitely so strange to me that this was in my church, yet there were people or kids who were in my class that didn't attend the church, and you know, some of them I met up with later in life when I went to Mays. So yeah.
And what about in church itself, the stuff you did as a kid here at the 21st?
I feel like I did it all, man. It was, you know, going to Sunday school. I was dedicated as a baby here, and I was in the nursery and went to Sunday school Wednesday nights with Bill, and I had Ben Marquez as my youth group leader for senior high, and he's now a pastor at Eastminster. And yeah, I mean, I did all I was your typical, like, I don't know, I was there for every event. I never missed an event.
That was required.
Yeah, and my parents were very heavily involved in the church, and so I just went when they went. But I did enjoy it, for sure.
Let's ask another question. How many people were married in this church? Okay. Jana, you were a young adult over at Gow and met your spouse there, correct? What was it like being a young adult at the Gow Church, and what kind of things developed there?
Yeah, that was a fun time as well. There was a large group of singles, college, and young career people at the Gow Church. And when I started working here in Wichita, I was invited to First MB and got to meet the large group, and they had a lot of things going on, lots of social activities, Sunday school classes, Bible studies, and so on. And slowly, we started to notice that people were starting to date each other, and then they were getting serious, and then there were engagements, and after a while, we had a slew of weddings out of the singles population, and that pretty much decimated it. They all got married. So it was a great memory. I remember, I think Doug Dick and I helped make homemade ice cream one time, and it was the first time we'd ever done that, and we left some ingredient out, like vanilla or something. But everybody enjoyed it anyway. We just liked being together, so that was a lot of fun.
Now, Bill, you weren't born into the church, you married into the church. How was it coming into the church as a non-Mennonite? Everybody's talked about what a family this was and all the Mennonites together. What was it like for you to come in as a non-Mennonite?
It was very different. I was 17 years old. Patty and I were high school sweethearts, and she invited me to come to church on a Sunday night. Since I was trying to make a good impression on her parents, I agreed to. I had no idea what a Mennonite was. The only thing I knew was that it was somehow different because her grandmother always referred to me as the English boy. In her world, you were either Mennonite or English. And so, the very first night, again, was a Sunday evening, and as we walked in the front door, I realized very quickly this was not a Methodist church, because her father, Ed Willems, said to me, "You come with me." And all the men went to one side of the church, and all the women went to the other side of the church. So I was sitting between him and John Croker, Nancy's dad, who I'd met for the first time, a room full of strangers, and all of a sudden, men started praying one at a time, out loud, and it was moving toward me. As I began to realize that I was going to be expected to say something out loud, which I'd never done before in church, rose considerably. And when it finally got back to Ed, who was on my right, and he began to pray, I began to pray pretty loudly to myself, something along the lines of, please don't let me make a fool of myself. And I began to think that this was like some sort of a Mennonite torture test to eliminate English boys. But fortunately, God heard my prayer, and as soon as Ed was done, John Croker immediately launched into a prayer, and so saved me from making a fool of myself. And so that was 56 years ago, and I've been here ever since, despite the shaky start. And I'm by no means the only English boy in church now.
That's right. Hey, Bill, while you have the mic, I want to go back to Gal a little bit, and I know you were very involved in the decision to move from Gow to 21st and the planning of that and making that happen. What can you tell us about how that went?
Well, of course, it took a lot of planning. I was on the planning committee, and I think we met almost weekly for about 3 years. And of course, we had subcommittees that advised us on what kind of a kitchen and what kind of office space, and we met with a number of architects and builders, and it took a lot of work to get to this point. I do have one funny story that I remember. After we had actually begun construction here, I don't think any walls were up. I think maybe we had poured the concrete, and so there were plumbers and electricians and people working here. And one day I came over to meet with the superintendent of Evans Construction, who was the contractor on the job. And we were walking around. I think maybe in this room there were no walls or windows or ceilings. And this young electrician, he might have been 25 years old, I think he was pulling wires. And he came up to us and he said, I've been here for 2 days and I have no idea what's this place going to be. And I think maybe I said, or the contractor said, it's going to be a Mennonite church. And he said, oh no. He said, a UPS driver was here a couple of hours ago wanting to deliver a package to the Mennonite church, and I told him this can't be it because this is going to have electricity. That's where we begin to break down the misconceptions, I think, at that point.
There's been already some mentions made of music in the church and how important that is. Patty, can you talk a little bit more about your dad and his, because he basically got the music in this church established?
Well, I remember on 2nd and Millwood as a little girl that our whole family life revolved around the church, and we lived 30 miles away, so we would come into town, Sunday morning and spent the day with my grandmother, and then came back in the evening, and then Wednesday night was always choir night. I mean, that's when everybody practiced the choir. And my memories are my parents, both of them sang a lot. I mean, my dad loved sacred music. To him, I think that was #1 in his life. And so as a result, our whole family life was built around that too. He always had directed the choir all through my growing up years up into when I was all through Gow. And he always had a men's chorus. I can remember he and my mother singing duets. They were always in quartets, trios. I have vivid memories of Mary Lou and Cal Weens being in everything too, singing. So I think for them and for most of the people in church, music was a very big deal. And then when we went to Gow, Velma Franz had this wonderful children's choir, and we all sang in that, even though I was one of the older ones. But we all sang, and it was just a big part of our life. And when my dad was 100 years old, he could tell you which songs he sang at which wedding and which funeral. I mean, that was very vivid in his mind.
Barry, you sang in choirs at Gow and here. What do you have some memories of about the music and the stuff that you participated in?
We started singing in the choir when we moved here in '72, and so I sang at the Gow Church with Don Heinrichs and Chuck Neufeld and Ed doing all of the men's chorus. He pulled something together on Sunday mornings. We'd show up if we didn't practice on Wednesday, and he'd hand out this sheet music, and we'd get every man we could up there to sing for the men's chorus on Sunday mornings. Once in a while he'd throw in a German song, and some of us were just kind of stuttering along because we didn't have any idea how to pronounce what we were looking at. But it went well. And then over here at this church, music has been a huge part. It's been a draw for this church. Tons and tons of new people have come specifically to sing in the choir, and it's still the case. There are people that are coming to first service because we are one of the few churches that still have a mixed choir on Sunday morning. It's been a real blessing. A lot of the other changes that have occurred is when we went to 2 and 3 services and Saturday services, we had the praise teams, which were an addition, and I've sung those for a long time. And then we also did big productions a lot of times at Christmas and Easter. We haven't done that in a while, but that used to be a big deal. We had drama. Kim Klein would direct a lot of the drama pieces, and just huge productions, particularly at Easter. And you know, just the groups that got together and all of the fun stuff that went with that, and the shenanigans that we pulled on each other occasionally when we were practicing or getting ready for performances was just cool.
Wendell, you've been in choir and the worship team a lot as well. And one time when we had a choir program, did you sort of make a solo entrance?
Yeah, I don't think it was a shenanigan that was planned, but we had rehearsed, and many times we did a processional where we would line up in the back and up the sides of both of the sanctuary, sanctinasium here, and our worship facility. And I believe Mary Lou Weens was behind me on this side, and Susan Franz was on the other side. And so I was the leader on this side, Susan on that side. Well, I didn't pay enough attention in practice, so I left at the wrong time. Mary Lou stayed standing there, and Susan didn't move either. So I was the only one, as I remember this, that came up on stage into the choir loft, and I was standing there behind the pastor, waiting, and everybody was still there. So they did their job, but I got hung out to dry just a bit.
What about worship team, Wendell? You've done that quite a bit as well?
Yeah, and I was just trying to reflect back. I mean, music has been something, the common denominator for all 30-some years that I've been here, and as everybody's mentioned, such a rich heritage. And I remember there's been lots of transitions in the worship team, and you know, the multiple services and contemporary praise songs. And so I was thinking back to the early days of when that first time was that we sort of introduced some praise songs. And there may be differing opinions on this, but this is my story, so I'll stick with it. But I don't know how many of you remember Dave T. Everybody remember Dave T? So bigger than life, lots of energy, enthusiasm, and so he came to the music and worship team at that time, and we were working together to try to figure out when we could introduce some worship songs. And so we decided to do that during the Advent season. And so over those weeks, we sang, we called it Christmas Praise. And so that was what my recollection was of those beginning times. And then, of course, Kathy Fazer came, and she was energetic and great and helped take music on all sides of music further. And then, of course, Doris Prater and Kim and others that have come along. And Kim has really helped us in taking what we would call the praise singing or the worship team to great levels. And as I'm sitting in here looking at this area, and Barry did call it a sanctinasium when we were talking earlier, but some of the changes in our worship experience. If you think about this room, that little closet right there by the trash can, that was the sound closet or sound booth. And I can remember distinctly Arnie Clausen and Mark Schrock and many, many others trying to make this work. And, you know, it's almost outside the building, but now we have unbelievable sound capabilities in the worship hall. Here, if you wanted to do something with lights, there was an on and off switch. If you turn them off, you might wait 15 minutes to come back on. And if you wanted some special lighting, you can see back up in the balcony, there's a nice little pull-down ladder that you can go up and adjust. And of course, now it's different in our hall. And so many, many changes to the worship experience in terms of the growth of that. But I have the best memories ever of this hall and all the performances and all the things we've done. So.
Now, Barry mentioned the productions we used to do at Easter and Christmas. Kendra, do you remember the first role that you played in a church production?
Promise You?
No. You
Oh, I was Baby Jesus.
You were, yes.
And I apparently was not having it that day.
Yes, Kendra was 3 months old and was playing Baby Jesus in the Christmas production, and Scott and Stephanie Harder were Joseph and Mary, and when Kendra started to fuss in just a little bit, suddenly Jesus had a pacifier. A pink pacifier. Yeah, I was actually going to ask Jana about that, but she moved off to the side. So, Jana, I want to ask you what it was like to be married to Jesus. Because many of you may remember that for a number of consecutive years, Gene Hildebrandt played the part of Jesus in our productions and was up on the cross. What was that like for him?
Oh boy. Yeah, Gene got invited to be a guard in one of the Easter plays, and then somehow they moved him to being like a disciple or something. Pretty soon it was like, can you be Jesus? Because he had the beard and the longer hair, and you know, he was okay with that. But then it like moved all the way to like, can you be on the cross? So that was pretty scary. In something that, yeah. Anyway, so he was brave, and I don't know. I think our kids are kind of messed up because they had to live with Jesus, and he didn't always parent perfectly, but I do remember that the last time he played Jesus, then at Easter, then a few months later, the youth group did a drama called Ansylvania. I don't know how many of you remember that. And we traveled with that, and we were youth sponsors, and so one morning Gene was asked to promote Ansylvania, and he came out on stage as an exterminator. And that really messed with the little kids because he was Jesus, right? And now he was killing bugs. So, yeah.
The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away.
Well, interestingly enough, I think he may have an influence on my son, because my son ended up playing Jesus after Gene was done, and now he's doing missionary work around the world. So
there you go.
It must have had a good effect.
There you go.
And Christy's got a story about Ansylvania.
That was one thing that I forgot to say. Ansylvania was huge for those of us that were part of it. Where, of course, the amazing drama talents of Wendy Isaac and Kim Neal, and we were up here as aunts, and the second year I wasn't part of the second one, there was a second one, and they took it on the road, and it was this huge thing. And I also remember Doug Dick as Salty the Songbook, way back when.
Jan, I did want to ask something else that the worship team brought to mind. And that's when we changed services up a little bit. We went to 2 Sunday schools at the same time we went to 2 services. And there were a lot of logistical things that went into that, and you were a part of that. What was that like?
Yeah, I was the adult education coordinator at that point, and we had a little team of people that worked really hard to try to avoid that. You know, there's always some growing pains. When you're a church that's growing and getting bigger and bigger, there are changes that you don't necessarily want to make, but when you've exhausted all the other options, there's only one thing to do, and that was to go to 2 Sunday schools and 2 services, and that was a really hard change for us. But I really have appreciated this church family. Over the years, we've had to make some hard changes. But we've done that. We've done that for the sake of moving the gospel message forward and making more room for people here in the First MB family. And so that has just been a real blessing to me to see how we've embraced those changes, hard as they were, in order to keep the family growing and to allow the gospel message to flow here more easily.
Jana mentioned that she and Gene were youth sponsors for a time. Barry, you did that as well over at the Gowa Church, correct?
Yeah, at the Gowa Church, if you were a new couple in the church, you automatically were expected within the first 2 years to be an MBY sponsor. And so Don and Lori Flory and Ken and Bart Jansen and Bob and Joyce Wall and Diana and I ended up being sponsors in the MBY for a long time. And we started a fine tradition. The Clausens had a boat. And so in the summers, we would take the kids, and Gary and Jeff and Gene and a bunch of others would end up, we would go to lakes and we would have a weekend and we'd have a speaker. And one of the funny stories is one year we were up at Milford Reservoir, and Fenimore Blow at the time was working, I think, for Youth for Christ, and he was going to be our speaker. And we had tents set up, and it's evening, and we had the fire going, and all of a sudden, I introduced Fenimore Blow to get up and speak, and the wind went from 0 to about 60 miles an hour in about 10 seconds. Tents were blowing into the lake. Fenimore Blow brought the wind, and I don't think we even got to talk for about 45 minutes because we were still retrieving tents and things from around the campground in the lake.
That's what we call divine intervention.
It was, it was. He must have had nothing good for us to hear. There are a lot of people from this church that have been very active in the district as well with youth. Many of us have served on the Youth Commission. Christy has done so. There's a number of others out there. Daryl Balzer was on the Youth Commission with me. And we started things in the district. One of the things that we started was the growth retreats, where the youth that were leaders in all the churches for the Southern District would get together in the fall, and we would do a special weekend of training for them before they went back and completed their terms the following year. So youth and youth ministry has been a real focal point for this church, both for young and high school and even young adults.
And Christy, you carried on as youth sponsor after attending here as a youth. And so what was that like? What kind of things do you remember from your time as a sponsor?
I remember when I was still in college, of course I had a relationship with Neil, and he was doing a big event for the senior high, and they did something called Mission Impossible. So it was when the first movie came out, and the whole church was like decked out, and the kids basically went on a Mission Impossible search throughout the church. And I vividly remember this was like the coolest thing ever. I was like an interim kind of leader, and this room was black. And in the first movie, what's his name? Tom Cruise has to like get hooked up into a rope, and he lowers down in this tubular room, but he can't touch the floor because if he touches it, the alarms will go off. So Neil had it all set up. He has somebody, like this whole contraption set up so the kids are climbing up scaffolding and they're being lowered down by somebody who is a trained professional, lowering them down, and they're hanging there at a computer. And I'm on the other side of the computer, the screen things back there are shut, and I just remember Brett Thiessen, who was like my second brother, hanging there, typing me a message, and I was just so angry back to him. But the fire alarms went off because there was smoke, and so it was those things even when I was a student and when I was then in college, realizing, hey, I want to come back and give back. So of course, going to camps and youth conference and being a leader. But I really think, in addition to the music thing that's been so important as part of this church, I think relationships are also a huge part of that. And I think that started for me as a youth group kid. Those were my friends. Those are the people I did stuff with and I had fun with. And my parents didn't care what time we came over to our house, and Mom made pizza, and it didn't matter because they knew where we were and they knew we were good kids. Doing things like just being a small group leader. If you've ever thought about it, you should just do it. It's such a great opportunity to just kind of get to know some kids on a different level. That mentorship aspect for teenagers is so important because, yeah, we can, well, not me, but you can be a great parent, but kids need somebody else to talk to. And so that was attractive. I vividly remember one of my first groups of girls that went through all 4 years. Our best conversations on Wednesday nights during small group were in one of the girls' hot tubs. We had the best conversations. Sitting in the Weisenbach's hot tub, just breaking down what we talked about during whatever our lesson was. One of the gals brought a friend from school that she had just kind of made a relationship with, and sometimes it was like, oh, do we really want her around? And she was just hanging out at my house one night, and I very vividly remember her saying, she came from kind of a rough home, no really church background. I remember her specifically saying to me, how do you know God is real? And that was for me like, this is why I do what I do. And even growing up as a youth group kid and then being a sponsor, what we did as a district in Kansas and Oklahoma and Colorado to bring our kids in the Southern District together was so impactful for me that I wanted to be part of Youth Commission. So I think I served on Youth Commission mission for like 10 years and helped plan things like camp and youth conference, because those were the highlights of my faith journey. And then the next step for me then from there is serving on our national committee. So now bringing our kids from all over the U.S. together once every 4 years and serving on YouthCon, so I'm part of that too. So it's still, even though I'm not with our specific kids every Wednesday night or whatever it is, I guess Sunday, still making that impact has been really important to me.
Gary, you went through youth group and also had your kids go through youth group. Have you noticed changes over the years in how youth is handled?
Well, at the Gow Church, when I was in high school, there were, my senior year, there were 13 guys and 1 girl. Sorry, Carolyn Schmidt. Nobody wanted to go out with her. She'd been in the group for so long. So it was just a bunch of guys getting together. And so we were back with Maxine and Brad Unruh and John Bays and Cindy. And so, again, at that time, I was this impressionable kid who was exposed to all kind of things in the world. And I think that the strength that I got to live out my faith came from the things I learned in our church, hanging out with people. Like Brent took off to Indonesia when I was 13, I think. So he wasn't part of my life after that. So people would come and go in our lives, but still the steadfast ideals of this is what we stand for, this is what we live for, this is why you, if you have to stand out and be different from other people, that's okay. And then now, as my kids get older, I think, I don't think we do Bible verses like we used to. I don't think we don't drive that information into them like I felt it was driven into me. I would be nervous coming to church because I didn't have my Bible verse memorized. And like, Mom, quickly, listen to me, is this right or not? There's not that kind of pressure anymore. So the dynamic for kids is so different, and they're exposed to so much more than I was ever exposed to. They have trials that I can't even begin to imagine. That if I would have had to face those, I probably would have felt miserably. So I see the people who are working with our kids, and I see what they're doing to help them exist in this world. And now they wear shorts to church, and they wear flip-flops, and they just have most of my pictures, I'm wearing a suit and a tie up to 12 years old.
And you were a better Christian for it.
I was. So the world's just going to pot. Well, I'm going back to I'm going way back. If you want to talk about discipline, I'm sorry to say, corporal punishment was a real thing back in the day, and it was not unheard of for the Ricewick boys they're talking too much or they're giggling, and all of a sudden Mom sweeps down and grabs the ear, and you're like walking out of church this way. It's like, no. And Dale is preaching while we're doing this. Everybody understands this has to happen, right? So the foyer was just a set of double doors in a room like maybe 14 by 20 feet. And so you could just hit from the congregational area, you could hear this whack, whack, whack. No. And my mom was always, she was kind, so she would take me into the ladies' bathroom and do it there, as if nobody could hear it from there. And I just thought it was interesting because there was like, the stained glass window was pink in there. And I thought, well, that's neat. You're going to get beat up. At least I got some insight about what the girls' bathroom is like. So, at least we don't do that anymore.
The sense of community. The adults would tap each other on the shoulder from 4 rows back and send a shoulder tap up, and then whoever was sitting behind the boys in about the middle of the church would have to take care of the discipline for the people in 4 rows back.
That's what we call community, yes. As the church got bigger, it was harder to maintain some of the community, and so that's when we started small groups, life groups, and Wendell, you were a part of that. Can you talk a little bit about that from your perspective?
Yeah, we've been loved being part of our life group, and it was just this really great God experience where there were some new folks coming to our church, and I don't remember how new they were, but Kyle and Linda Stewart. And they had gone to the church office or whoever and asked to be in a life group. And our active life group, we were kind of processing, we were wanting to add someone, and So we suggested, hey, maybe we should call the stewards. This was completely independent of them going to the church to ask to be in one. So I called up Kyle on behalf of our life group and I said, hey, would you like to be in our life group? And he said, well, sure. And I thought, well, are you not going to talk to Linda or think about it or anything? But in his mind, I was just calling because the church had requested that we call. So it was just really neat the way that came together, and we just had an unbelievable experience going through life together.
Now, Wendell, you have been in various leadership positions in the church, lay leadership positions. What's that experience been like?
Oh, it's a great privilege. I look across this room. How many people have been involved in lay leadership or staff? There's got to be a lot of hands, but it's a great privilege to do that. And you know, when you're just attending church and you're maybe not in a lay leadership position, you look across and you see everything looks kind of normal. And I was just thinking about how to compare when you jump into leadership. It's like going snorkeling. You put your head in the water and you realize, oh my goodness, there is a lot of fish in there and a lot of different colors. And so there's a lot of dynamics to leadership, and we've just had unbelievably great leaders and staff that have taken the church all these different journeys from the very beginning until now. And you know, when I was part of it, we had a really unique situation, not only with the discernment process where you were chosen, but then also being paired up with staff. And so that was very interesting, leading together with staff. And of course now we've grown a lot bigger and things have changed, and so all part of that process. But a great privilege, but also a lot of sacrifice from all the people that have been involved in the staff and in lay leadership.
And Jan, I think you are probably our longest tenured staff person of the current staff, and so you've seen a lot of things happen. What are some of your thoughts just on your time here in that role and seeing all the people that have come through? What kind of thoughts do you have about that?
Yeah, there are people that are called into ministry as pastors, and then there are people that are called to church families. And as I have looked over my years, I realized that I was called to this family. I've been called to help pastor this family, and so that's been a real privilege. It's, like I mentioned earlier, we've gone through a lot of growing phases. You think about children growing up and the times that you have to walk through some difficult times with them, like learning to eat their broccoli or something like that. And we didn't always walk through all of those stages really gracefully, but we did it with a lot of forgiveness and a lot of humility and a lot of patience. And I'm just so honored to sit in this room with people who I might not have always been on the same side of issues with, but we worship together and we love each other. And we've talked about that before. We're family, right? Family doesn't always agree on everything. We don't always respond well to each other, but we're family and we stick together and we live life out together. And so I've just been really blessed to do that. And like I said, it's been an amazing journey. And I do have to mention that one of the people that had been here almost as long as I had been was Annette Vicks, and she helped hold this church together in so many ways as our membership secretary. She was watching for all the people. When she would go through the database and mark attendance, she was doing it oftentimes by memory of who she saw that morning. And so I was just always so impressed by how she watched out for you and how she cared for you. She was just a great blessing here as well.
We're at 10:41 now, Jen. I understand we have a little leeway because the food's not quite on time.
Correct.
Okay.
We're watching for John Olsey to step through the doors and wave his arms, and then we know that we're good to go. The services are also running a little late, so we can just keep chatting here. And I should mention, I think this is kind of fun. About a year and a half ago, I was reading through my grandmother's diary, and on May 16, 1943, I came across an entry, and the diary is actually out on the table, but I came across an entry. She lived in Hillsborough, and she wrote about the first meeting of First MB Church and how there were 19 members in attendance, and Estelle Shale had been voted in as the pastor. So it's just a really cool thing to know that I've got connections to this church family from way back on the first day. What a blessing.
If you have a chance this morning, you'll probably pick up one of the booklets that has a church history in it. And I had a part in compiling that and did that from some histories that have been put together over the years for different events. And it is interesting that the earlier histories are so detailed, I guess because there wasn't that much history at that time. I mean, they would talk about who spoke at this service and who sang, and that was part of the church history, was the specific details about exactly what happened at a particular service. And that was very interesting to read, although not all was included in what you're going to be seeing. It's also, I learned a couple of things about the 19 people who were the beginnings of this church, and Gary mentioned that his great-grandparents were among the charter members. I think the last charter member who was alive was Edna Weeby, if I recall. She was the last one to pass away. But there's just some things in there. For instance, the first funeral in the church was in 1945, and it was the infant son, Isaac and Linda Clausen, who passed away. And so, you know, you can imagine in a small church what kind of a trauma that was to the entire church. Or the Shenkovskys, the Orville and Roselle. I learned in doing some work for the history that in 1967 they had moved to California, and he and their 15-year-old son were killed on a camping trip when they got swept away in the river, and how that story then came back to this area and the people who knew them. And so, you know, there's been a lot of ups and downs and births and deaths and marriages and good times and bad in this church. And you all have been a part of that, and so it's a good thing to celebrate, I think. And we will soon be eating. Until we do, we're got some time to talk. Was it 10 minutes? Okay. Barry, I want to ask you a little bit about a non-church activity, not necessarily church activity, but this church has been fairly involved in church league softball and things of that nature. And one thing I do want to mention is, those of you who are in kind of that back strip of the activity center, that has been the wrecking ground for about 7 different knees that I'm aware of. And Tuesday night basketball, I remember Jeff taking, I think it was Joel Friesen, back to his office to sew him up after he got a gash on his forehead. So it wasn't always gentle and pacifistic at Tuesday night basketball. Barry, what do you recall about leading some of the other athletic activities?
When we were at the Gow Church, there were a lot of us that were just out of college and young guys, and we just wanted opportunities to get together. And so athletic activities tended to be a way for those of us that were younger in the church to bond. Bob Wall and Dennis Clausen and a bunch of others of us, we played church league softball for years, and those games were not pacifistic either. We played at all the little junior high schools around the town, and we had basketball in the winter, and then in the summer we played a lot of softball. In fact, in the 80s and early 90s, First MB was the terror of the Greater Wichita softball leagues. I mean, we were the team to beat. John Kozlowski and Wendell and Mark Schrock, and when we ran low on guys, they got to be in mid-30s and they started to quit playing. We recruited these high school kids that had never touched a softball in their lives, didn't know which hand to catch which and which hand to throw with, and by the time they played with us a couple of years, they were pretty good ball players. And then they'd leave, and some of us actually went through about 4 or 5 generations. It's still going on, by the way. Countryside Christian Church on the southeast side of town, about 5 years ago, invited First MB to come over and play summer co-ed softball with them. And the first year we had 5 teams from this church that drove across on Sunday afternoons to the southeast corner of Wichita and played softball with Countryside Christian. This last year we fielded 1 team, and we would have to borrow players from other churches to get 10 on the field. And there are actually 5 different churches that are now playing in that league, so it's still going on, and a lot of fun experiences. I only knocked Buffy Branham's tooth out 1 time playing softball, or playing basketball actually. He made the mistake of standing still when I went past him.
Always dangerous, yes. I coached a ladies softball team about the 2nd year after we moved here. My wife played on it, and I remember Joni Ince and Deanne Alexander or Carol Owens. and Chris Dara and Stephanie Walker Lear played on that team. But we also had on that team Peggy Hadley, who many of you know. And Peggy was a fair amount older than most of the other players on the team. And she never told us why she had decided to come out to play, but I got the impression it was because she was trying to make a point to somebody in her family. And at the beginning of the season, I told the players, I said, look, a lot of times in ladies softball, the goal is to try and walk your way on base because the pitcher isn't throwing strikes. We're not going to do that. We're not here to take walks. We're here to swing the bat. So I want you to go ahead and swing the bat. Well, we were playing a team one time who had a pitcher who was struggling, and the bases were loaded, and Peggy was up, and this pitcher could not throw a strike, but everything she threw, Peggy would swing at, and so I pulled her aside after she had 2 strikes, and I said, Peggy, you know, you don't have to swing at everything. And she said, you told us not to walk. No, not necessarily exactly like that. She was very literal about that. Okay. Jen, anything else?
Yeah, we're still figuring out timing here.
One of the things, there we are. One of the things I was going to mention, by the way, about that is that Gene and I were on a co-ed team when our first son was born, and his first outing was to one of our church games, and I was going to sit in the stands and hold Jason, who is not even a week old, and we got to the game and realized we were short people on our team and we were going to have to forfeit. This is how serious this church was about softball. Somebody found me a pair of shoes, men's shoes, put me out in the field. Now, mind you, I'd been in a hospital a week ago giving birth. We handed Jason off to a stranger, and I stood out in the outfield. They promised that they would chase the ball down if it came my direction, and that was how we played the game so that we didn't forfeit. We were serious. How are we doing on time, Scott? Okay. Yeah, so you...
All right, one thing I do want to mention is sometime today, make your way over to the wall that is right outside of these doors here, and there's a timeline. And we'd like everybody to put on that timeline when they started attending the church. And so we can kind of see, and it's okay that if you left, you still attended at some point, go ahead and put your name on there so we can see as many people as possible. Oh, tell about the photo booth, Jenny, you know better than I.
Yeah, we've got a photo booth back there. It's an arch of balloons, and we've got all kinds of fun things to hold and take pictures with. So we want to be sure to invite you to come back and have your photo taken over there as well. We've got a team of photographers there ready and waiting for you. And so just hang out here. We'll let you know when the service is let out for those of you that are heading into the 11 o'clock service, and we'll also let you know when the food lines are ready to go.
Okay, and I think when we go, if you go through the food line, the logistics, Jen, are to go through those doors there?
Right, head through the doors that are on the far side, on the other side of the balloons there, and then come around the hallway past the kitchen, and that'll get you through the crowd that might be coming this direction.
Okay, and if you're going to service, you can go out these doors here and fight the crowd. Okay, I want to thank everybody who was able to be on the panel. Appreciate you all, and thank you all for being here.